special look. See, the POM was being done on current numbers, but this was to forecast what the end state of the shape of the Army would be after Vietnam, after the drawdown was completed. So it was a special look. It was done like, you know, for example, when Carl Vono was Chief of Staff of the Army after the Cold War ended, he had to come to grips with how to take down the size of the Army, and then what size would the Army be? Well, we had 18 active and 10 reserve divisions, and he ended up with 12 active and 6 divisions. So you have to go through a process of how do you scale all that, and then how much money and how many people does it take, and so it's a question of iterating to get to the right answer on what size will the force be on the one hand, and then later would be what does it take to support that in financial terms, personnel terms.
When you spent these 8 hours a week with the Secretary of the Army, you would have documents that you would present him.
Yeah.
What would they look like? Would they be lists of activities and procurements and constructions and numbers of people associated with dollars?
Stan Reeser was one of the, I have enormous respect for him. He's one of the men who got into the details of how things operated and ran. So maybe one week we would spend it on force structure, and another week we'd spend it on research, development, and procurement. Another week we'd spend it on how would the people be provisioned, where would they be going, and how many would it take for the training establishment. Like, so it was sort of broken up into piece parts that when you assembled it holistically, then you had a forecast of what a new 5-year program would look at after the end state was achieved.
What kind of questions would he ask?
Well, if you recall, we had an ammunition problem. Let me just give you one little indicator. You may recall that in the aftermath of the Korean War, there had been an allegation that we had a shortage of ammunition. Well, Resor had a guy in the desk law business that did nothing but monitor ammunition, because he said, you know, we'd never run out of ammunition as long as he was Secretary of the Army in Vietnam. So, for example, he would look specifically at an ammo account and say, you know, show me how we have made provision with the right amount of money to go in the ammunition accounts, or show me where this force is supposed to do its job in Europe, and do we have the right amount of reserve forces in to back it up, and the right amount of supporting force, which would be what we know now to be the combat support and combat service support, to support the 13 and 3rd Divisions. We were committed to a defense planning questionnaire that said we had to get 10 divisions to Europe. Later that would become 10 divisions in 10 days as we go later into the 70s. But at those days it was 13 and 3rd Divisions with 5 divisions deployed overseas, 4 divisions deployed overseas. So he'd be interested in the details. What would have to be the draft rate in order to sustain that kind of force? Because we didn't have an all-volunteer Army at that time. Came in with the Nixon administration later on. So thorough inspection of the accounts, because he's very competent. I mean, he spent a very long tour, I don't know the exact number, but several years as the Chief of the Secretary of the Army. And so he was a detail man. And he got into the details. How big would the NCO Corps be, and what would be the officer corps, and how many people would be trained at places like Leavenworth and the Army War College, all of which got into the details of what the training account would be in the Army.
What would be the criteria for justifying, say, this is enough, or this is too much, or this is inadequate?
Well, we had a thesis that 13 and the 3rd Divisions met our immediate need in NATO. So that became a driving parameter. What would the force structure be? Then we had these other special mission brigades, they were called in those days, separate brigades. Alaska, Panama, elsewhere, that we had to provision. And so once you took that force together, you could then determine what and based upon assumptions made on what the disposition of how many posts we'd keep open and that kind of stuff, well, you could make assumptions on how much you thought it was going to cost you to do that. Now, money wasn't necessarily a constraint, although we may have supplied some constraints at that particular time in order to give us some sort of reasonableness in terms of how much money we were going to have. But I don't recall that particular constraint. We may have had one, but I just don't recall what it was. If you might go back sometime and look at some of the records archives on the AVICE business in the year 1970 and early 71, get some indicator of that. I don't have any documents about it. My recollection is that there were physical constraints obviously going to come in, but the principal constraint was get rid of people.
Right.
Because you were running a draft, you had to get rid of the draft. Because the draft was an oppressive thing in American psyche, and therefore you wanted to reduce, on the one hand, you wanted to reduce the force level to the right force to support Europe, and on the other hand, you wanted to get rid of as much of the draft as you could get rid of. Because that was an unwelcome thing in America. We're talking about 1970 now. Now, in the case of how much money you would spend in procurement, research and development and acquisition, I can recall putting that POM together with a figure of about $2.3 billion, which provided the requisite amount of money for R&D for the Apache, at that time the Cheyenne, later it would go into the Apache, a main battle tank, a thing called the MiG-V, which turned out later to be the Bradley, and a UTAS, which was a utility aviation helicopter, which would later turn out to be the Black Hawk. But all these things were in R&D in those days. They were not in production. So it was rather modest in terms of mainly ammo in production, trucks, some communications gear, but very modest procurement, and mainly R&D, which later would provide the ability to take off when the Reagan years came to come upon us. We had what was called a bow wave of procurement money. In other words, we were spending more money, and we were projecting to spend more money. We were projecting to spend money in R&D that when the items arrived at procurement time, the procurement funds would exceed what we had in our program. And that was called the bow wave of modernization. And guys like Don Keith, who was the Desperata later the AMC commander, other people would look at as saying, my God, the Army will never be able to buy that stuff. It's got too much stuff on its plate, not enough procurement money. Turns out when Reagan came along, we had the stuff in research and development waiting to be bought. So we bought it, and that's what went to war in Desert Storm. So there's a big argument about bow waves and all that, but my own admonition about that is you always want a bow wave. In case you have to go fight, you got to have equipment to outshoot, outfight the enemy. And we had that, fortuitous, when the Reagans arrived. But there were constraints placed on what the fiscal constraints. I don't recall. I just don't recall that. I'm sure we had some, but I don't recall what they were.
So you became a colonel during this period, didn't you?
Well, I became a colonel, and I was out of that job when I became a colonel. I became a lieutenant colonel promotable, and I was promoted to colonel in about April of 1973. And by that time, I'd left that job because my brother had come to take over as my boss, and Depew said, "You can't work for your brother. That's nepotism. So you work for me as my special assistant, getting me ready to go down to TRADOC. You'll help me organize TRADOC." And because the general order.
Was TRADOC brand new? That was.
Well, there had been a general order signed creating TRADOC and Forces Command from CONARC, effective 1 July 1973. And by this time, I was on orders to go to the 82nd Airborne Division to command that. And that's a whole nother story. So in the intervening period of about 4 months, I worked for Depew, helping him get organized to go to TRADOC. And I set up some systems down at TRADOC, which would be helpful to him. And I essentially staffed TRADOC.
Hired the people working.
To staff the, Depew's view was if he had 20 good colonels, 20 good lieutenant colonels, and 20 good majors, that was enough to run the 100,000 person TRADOC, plus his own genius and the general officers. So I was the officer in charge of finding out who the 20 good colonels, 20 good lieutenant colonels, 20 good majors were. I did a pretty good job at it.
How'd you do that?
Well, the Office of the A-Vice had the authority to requisition files from Milperson. And so I did that. I'm now his special assistant.
Right.
So I did that. I looked through 1,000 files. And what I did was I looked at them on the grounds, were the people reasonably available in the summer of 1973 for a PCS movement. In other words, I wasn't trying to remove anybody from a current job. So, for example, in the Greater Major, I looked at all the people serving at Leavenworth, going to school there, and all the people at the various staff colleges, including the Armed Forces Staff College. 2 of those guys I hired. One guy they both were operations research analysts, West Point graduates, distinguished combat records in Vietnam, gone to Naval Postgraduate School, and were coming out of the Armed Forces Staff College. One of them's name is Thomas Carney. He's now Lieutenant General and Death Spur of the Army. Another guy was Major General. At that time, Major. Both these guys were majors. It's Major Steve Silvasi. He did service in the Dominican Republic where he'd won the Silver Star. He's now a Major General in the Army, and he's the J7 of the Joint Staff. So those were a major named Dane Starling, who was a logistics officer, just retired in 1993 as Lieutenant General, Transportation Officer, Lieutenant General, being the Deputy Sync at Transcom. If you begin to get the picture,
You got this budding stars.
got somebody, well, I knew enough about how to screen a file for talent. In other words, they had to be good at their own branch for openers. They had to be right for this kind of assignment. In other words, they had to have had the credentials with the troops at the right grade so that they wouldn't miss out doing that. They had to have good files. And then they had...
These include efficiency reports.
Yeah, so they had to have good file, although the efficiency reports were less important. What was important were what jobs had they had. And then Depew wanted a 4-man staff group that worked directly for him in combat developments. So I hired 4 guys for that. One guy was commanding the 2nd Division Artillery in Korea, coming out in the summer of '73. He had been the exec to Major General Jack Dean when Jack Dean was putting in the McNamara line in Vietnam, sensors. And Dean later would become the AMC commander. And this officer also had a tour in combat developments in the building, and been a DeVarty commander, so the chances are, 95 to 5 he's going to be a general officer. And had a degree from, so he knew the R&D community, and his name was Bill Bardishaw, and he was later promoted to brigadier general. Second guy I hired was a White House fellow, cavalry aviator, then studying at the Hoover Institute. And when I called him up and said he was going to come there, he could have killed me. Because, see, Konark had the reputation of being the land of the sleeping colonels. And his name was Jack Woodmansee. He'd go on to be a corps commander in Germany, and he's now the chief operating officer of a very large firm in Dallas, Texas. Third guy was a specially selected. I had known him for the years I'd been a programmer in the Army, and his name was Jim Compton. And Jim was an artillery officer who knew systems, data systems in Des Ops, and also had been the NATO book handler in Des Ops. And so he would be extremely useful in terms of knowledge of the operation systems in the Department of the Army. And Jim is now retired and is employed as a civilian in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And the fourth guy was a guy that had never been to Washington. Troop officer. Made his living with the troops. His name was John Foss. He retired as a 4-star general.
So you did some good picking.
You bet. So I knew how to read records. And I picked guys like Bill Tuttle, who later became a 4-star general. Those 4 guys, Don Peel, who became a 3-star general. So there, quite a number of those guys did very well, and all of them resented coming to Fort Monroe and working for Bill DePue until they got there. And when they got there, they thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened, because Bill DePue was an electric leader. And so some of it, I didn't go to work there, I left. I mean, all these guys said, "You sorry son of a gun, you got us on orders to come in here, and
Had to leave the ship.
you're abandoning, you're bailing out." So then I went down and commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, artillery.
And that was, you said that's a story in that also.
That's a whole different story. That story is a study in what the Army used to do versus what it does now. The Army now selects brigade commanders, battalion commanders. Those days it didn't. You had to go get yourself a job.
Oh, really? So the individual initiatives for those, what?
Well, I mean, you just had to, you had to struggle to get an assignment, and you had to be accepted by the division commander. Right now, you don't get accepted by the division commander, you get issued to the division commander. But in those days, you had to run a race to get accepted to be a brigade level commander. Now, yeah, Mill Percent would nominate you, but
It was up
the
to
better way to do was to be asked for. So there was an officer going out to the 4th Division. And so I was still a lieutenant colonel promotable at that time, but I said to him, "I'd like to go out and be the Divarti commander at the 4th Infantry Division. He said, what do you know about self-propelled artillery? And I said, I know a lot about self-propelled artillery. I commanded a SP outfit in Vietnam. I know all there is to know about self-propelled artillery. It's going a little far because didn't know all about those nuke weapons and self-propelled. But I said then I'd been in the nuke weapons business in the United States, so it wasn't strange to me. So
Who was this guy you were talking to? Was he general, commander of division?
no, he was. He thought he was going to command a division, but in the end game he didn't get the division command, so I didn't get to go to the 4th Division. Then I went to Germany and applied to be the division artillery commander in the 8th Infantry Division. My brother was the ADC and had left the 8th Division, but I knew the 8th Division commander. So I asked the 8th Division commander if I could be the division artillery commander at the 8th ID.
You fly over there and hustle the job face
You
to
bet,
face?
you bet. And this is back now, deja vu or Vietnam. You follow me? And you gotta move out. I mean, you go back and look at my record. I only had 8 months or a year. I had 1 year with troops in a period from
About 12 or 13 years.
in a period of leaving. Since leaving the 82nd Airborne Division, and you could put it this way, leaving the 11th Airborne Division and the 24th Division in 1958, and now it was 1973. That is 15 years, right? And 1 year with troops. So when you looked at, going back to that criteria,
Yeah.
from Vietnam, over there at Milperson, why, humma. There were other guys that spent a hell of a lot more time with troops than I did. But General Michael Davison
From West Point?
from West Point was now Cinq Usurer, and he put another guy in as division artillery commander over there. So I didn't get that billing. Then I went down to the 1st Cav Division,
Fort Hood.
Fort Hood, Texas, and I knew the division commander slightly. He was an aviator, Major General Jim Smith. So I went down and interviewed with him and said, I'd like to come down and command your Divarti. He said, okay. After he mulled it over about 30 days, he said, okay. And about 30 days later, a guy called up and said, no, you're not going to command here, because the new division artillery commander here is going to be Colonel Jack Merritt. So now I'd struck out on 3 Divartis. Well, there were only 13 of them available. So then serendipitously, out of the blue, I get a call from Milperson, and my assignment officer is a colonel named Wendell Gilbert. And Wendell and I had been in the 11th Airborne Division together, the Mafia of the 11th Airborne Division. And Wendell says to me, would you like to be the Division Artillery Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division? And I says, you mean I don't have to go down for an interview? He said, no, General Crozan already knows you, so he would, I'd never served with Crozan, but he knew me by reputation because he'd known me on the Army staff. So he said he'll take you as a Divarti commander. I said, gee whiz. Going down to the 82nd Airborne Division, I'll take that in a heartbeat. How soon can I get there? So that's how that came about. But it's an interesting story of, in those days you had to work to get yourself a brigade commander.
It's no surprise to you. You've been managing your career in a very personal way before you even got in the Army. Just after you got in the Army.
Yeah, I'll never recall. Let me give you it's an episodic thing that is an example. When I came out of the 82nd Divarti, which was in about March of 1975, turned it over to Carl Bono. Milperson had asked me, where would you like to go? And I said, I'd like to be the chief of staff of any division in the Army worldwide. And they said, how would you like to go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma? And I said, I wouldn't like to go there. I already answered the question. You asked me the question, I answered the question. So in about a week, they called up and they said, Fort Sill would really like for you to go to Fort Sill. How would you like to go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma? And I said, I told you once, not twice, I'd like to go to be the chief of staff of any division in the United States Army. And they said, well, there are none available. And I said, well, you asked what I'd like to do, that's it. So about a week later, a guy calls up and he said, how would you like to go to Fort Sill? And I said, you keep asking me this question, I keep giving the same answer. I said, I've never been AWOL in my life in the Army. So if you cut the orders, I'll have to obey the orders. But you asked me where I want to go, and I'd rather be the chief of staff anywhere in the Army. Overseas, CONUS, doesn't make a difference. So they cut the orders, and obviously I reported to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. But it was that constant tension. Because I was an out of the ordinary, not because of competency, but because of where I'd gone in my career, that Milperson sort of took a little bit of a jaundiced look at where they thought I would be suitable to be assigned. So when I got in the business of trying to scrape up a job as a diverting commander, I had to go out and do a little work on myself. But in the end game, it came through. Milperson did assign me and got the job that anybody would crave to have, which is be the Division Artillery Commander of the 82nd. So now, having helped General Pugh get himself organized in famous downtown Tradoc, seeing that launched, I was gone by the month of June of 1973 and headed off to Fort Bragg and took over from Colonel Promotable Vernon Lewis, who had also been in the 11th Airborne Division. Working for Fritz Croson.
Sounds pretty much like Nirvana.
Pretty much like what?
Nirvana.
It's not bad. I'd never been assigned to the 82nd, but I'd had 4.5 years, almost 5 years in the 11th, so I was an experienced parachutist, knew what to do in the parachuting game. So although I hadn't been in the 82nd, I was soon to learn all the business about loading out fast. Because by September we had parachuted into Turkey in an exercise, and by October would come the Yom Kippur War of the 1973 war. October 73. And we got alerted to go over and fight them. So it didn't take long to, we didn't go. But it didn't take long to get organized for combat in the 82nd.
When you got there, how did you assess the go-to-war capability of your battalions?
You mean going in?
Yes, when you arrived, were those battalions as a group ready to go fight?
Oh yeah. The division had been high on the list of contingency forces to load out from CONUS, United States. They were well rehearsed. Vern Lewis had commanded, I think, 3 batteries and 2 battalions in combat, and he was a distinguished artilleryman, and so the units were very well trained. I mean, I knew that from personal knowledge. I had a very strong staff. Had an executive officer, his name was Raphael Holliday, who would later end up as a CG at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The S3 was an officer named Jerry Granrude, who would end up as Lieutenant General, Commanding General of U.S. Forces Japan, U.S. Army Japan, now. So if you look at those 2 guys, I had 2 sterling subordinates, both of whom had been in the division for couple of years as officers in battalions. Neither one had had a battalion at the time. And so the tempo of training in the 82nd was one of those things where it's easy for a guy like me to come slip into it. And everybody knew how to go do an immediate alert, rig equipment, get it ready to go and all that kind of stuff, because that was just routine operation. So early on that summer, ran a big combined arms live fire exercise with the Marines came up. Reserve artillery was embroiled in it, so we had a very large exercise. I think the best thing could be said about it was led by a distinguished combat veteran named Faris Russell. And I can't tell you how good the command climate was there. There's no way to express how good the command climate. I will never forget the entry session I had with Rosen after I signed in. I reported to him. I hadn't taken over the DeVarty. It was going to be the next day or something like that, but I had an office call with him that afternoon before. I'd known Rosen a little bit, but I never worked for him directly. Known him as a staff officer. And here is about a quote of what he said to me. He said, welcome to the 82nd Airborne Division. We're happy to have you being a DeVarty commander. And he said, I got a couple of instructions for you. He said, what I'd like for you to do is to command the division artillery. And I said, okay, I understand that. He said, you got some battalion commanders down there that have never commanded a battalion before. And so this is their opportunity to learn how to command a battalion. He said, so what I'd like for you to do is let them command their battalions. He said, what I'd like for you to do is, I'd like for you to command the DeVarty. And he said, you know, what I do is I command the division, and you command the DeVarty, and they command the battalions. You got that? I said, yeah, I believe I understand what you're talking about here. He said, incidentally, I've already commanded a division before. I mean, he had the Americal division in Vietnam. I said, I believe I understand this thing, cold turkey. Rosen had that taciturn, confidence building, non-frenetic, everything is doable, nothing is a crisis manner about him. So it wasn't a fear operation going to work for Fritz Rosen, because there wasn't any of that in the division. Now, when I got there in about the 15th of June, 1973, Ed Partain, whom I'd served with at West Point, was a brigade commander. Roscoe Robinson, who I didn't know, but who was later to be a four-star general, now deceased, untimely leukemia, sort of like my leukemia. And the 3rd Brigade commander.
Is that Bob Elton?
No, he hadn't taken over yet. The 3rd Brigade commander, I'll have to think about it. It was all 3 of those brigade commanders and Lewis, who I was succeeding, had come out on the brigadier general list. It was unheard of sort of have 4 guys from the same division at the same time come out on the brigadier general list. So I got there, I was sort of the rookie, and all these other guys were promotable to general officer.
You haven't even made colonel yet.
I'd made colonel in April. So within a period of about 40 days, 45 days, then Jim Lindsay took over brigade. He'd later be a 4-star general. Sandy Malloy took over brigade. And Bob Elton took over brigade. Guess he took over about that time. So when we ended up with the new team on board, they were all very competent guys at their craft. I thought I was a good artilleryman, so we had a very comfortable arrangement with the division commander. Fritz had told me that he wanted me to continue to run live fire exercises with battalions, and that I would be the officer in charge of those exercises and would be the chief safety officer in those exercises. And his admonition was to make them as difficult and as demanding as possible without killing anybody. And it was that interaction of me as a diverty commander with my colleagues on the one hand, but with their battalion commanders, because I had to run these exercises. So that's where I, for example, met Carl Steiner. And he was the battalion commander at that time. And Carl and I he was lieutenant colonel, commanding the battalion. I was a diverty commander, supporting him on the one hand, but acting as the controller and safety officer. And he and I went out and operated up and down in the middle of the nights and shot a lot of bullets together, and that bond continued when he was the 18th Airborne Corps commander and I went to Panama. I asked Chief of Staff of the Army to let me have him to be the tactical commander in Panama, because I had the utmost confidence in Carl Steiner. So, but the atmosphere with Croson, I don't believe he ever called me on the telephone. He may have called me in the course of 18 months. He may have called me once a month on the telephone.
They meet with you, periodic get-togethers of the...
Yeah, we met on once a month. We had what was called the Blue Room Commander's Call. We had all the senior officers of the division plus battalion commanders of all the units in the division. And we would meet frequently. But what I'm saying to you is that there was none of this burdensome, I read on the blotter yesterday that she had, or this morning, that she had some jabroni did X, Y, or Z or whatever. I mean, none of that. He called me, he used to routinely call me if he was going to make a decision on a court-martial proceeding that either went against me or ratified what I said. In other words, you're getting ready to take final action, always call me up and say, you know, I've reviewed this, I'm going to do A and B and C. You got any problem with that? No problem with that. The only other admonition that he had was that he expected to be notified if I planned to relieve anybody. It wasn't a question of him vetoing it. He wanted to be notified. He ended up relieving one battery commander and one battalion commander during the tour. So the point I want to make about it is it was not an oppressive command climate. It was everything you'd seek. And the reason you'd seek that, or the reason it happened, is because you have a man who is very comfortable in command, as everybody knows. I mean, saw him as a corps commander, saw him as a USAR commander, saw him as a force comm commander, saw him as a vice chief. He's a very approachable, solid, dignified, thoroughgoing, unflappable commander. I recall our getting tuned up to go to, we were out on an exercise. I was the architect of command post exercises. He assigned that to me as a functional mission. And so I was doing one of these about every 2 months or so. And we were in the field in October doing one. And we got an order to report to the Blue Room, and got in the Blue Room, and he said, there's a fracas going on in the Middle East. He said, exercise the 18th Airborne, or exercise the 18-hour alert. I raised my hand. I said, "Are you telling me to draw live ammunition and rig it?" He said, "Draw live ammunition and rig it." End of that. I mean, nobody asked any questions. You know, there wasn't any frantic this or that. This was in the middle of this 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. But we all knew our business. It was a very talented organization.
Now, this was a time when the Army was in very low repute in the country as a whole,
Yeah.
and still had primarily staffed, I guess, at the lower enlisted level with draftees.
Yeah, but yes,
Airborne's
but.
different, isn't it?
But airborne, you got a double volunteer system, you know, one to get in the Army and second to, you had to volunteer to get in the airborne, so that pushed a lot of people into the RA category.
Okay, so they'd made some decisions of a positive nature.
Yeah. I can recall only one rumble in the division. It was a particularly oppressive night, and the power went off in the division area. There were a lot of guys out in the street. Croson came down, walked around in the street, and that was the end of that.
Do you just walk around and talk to guys?
Yeah,
You see the sort of person who talk to soldiers?
sure you bet.
What do you talk about?
Again, I say quite taciturn. So he would go out and look at you in training, and he would walk up to a soldier and he would say, "How are you doing, soldier? How are you doing, sergeant? How are you doing, trooper? How are you doing, men?" If it was a howitzer section or a platoon of guys. And
They'd say, fine.
there was just no. He's a man that was loved by the troops. I'm just. There's some people that are and some people aren't.
Would they tell him how they were, or would they say, fine, sir?
No, I think he got a very good insight into the size and shape of the division. He had a peculiar. He put out a letter, which is one of the curiosities that I've ever seen put out by a senior guy. He wrote a letter to all of the command structure in the division, and it was called the 06-08 letter. And the 06-08 letter said, "This is an 08-06 commanded division." You notice he left out 07. Then he went on to cite what the relationship would be between the division commander and the brigade commanders. One pager. And then he said, "And the ADCs will assist me in carrying out my responsibilities."
Well, that's exactly
Now-
how it works, isn't it?
Yeah, but by leaving 07 out of it, you understood that I had access to the 08 anytime I wanted it, notwithstanding what the 07 had to say. Now, we got along with the 07. We had a distinguished group of brigadier generals. Jack Faris would be a lieutenant general. Joe Fant would later be a major general. Some more to come to mind here in a minute. But the point was, it was clear what the chain of custody was. It was between the division commander and the brigade commanders. And that permeated down the line. So, I mean, it wasn't any falderall about big brothers overlooking your shoulder. Now, these divisions, Volney Warner was one of the ADCs, later be a 4-star general. That particular letter was a stroke of elegance, I would say, on the part of the division commander to clarify relationships on the post. Now, I'd find the ADC, Volney Warner, used to go out and spend all the time jumping with us in the field and going through ATTs and battalion tests and battery tests and all that kind of stuff. But
He's just there watching?
yeah, Volney Warner would spend, he probably spent 300 days a year in the field. when he was the assistant division commander for maneuver. And if a battalion, infantry battalion went out in the field, that's 9 of them. Cav squadron, that's 10. If they went out in the field, he was in the field with them. I mean, made the parachute jump in with them, watched what they were doing, made the parachute, or followed them all through the activity, made the heliborne assaults with them, slept in the field, didn't come in out of the field for 3 days, 3 or 4 days while they were out there doing their ATTs, or their battalion test. We call them battalion tests in those days. And I had an arrangement with the my fellow brigade commanders to, whenever one of their battalions went in the field, one of my batteries went in the field, because that's the way we would deploy on the 18-hour sequence. So I'd jump with the battalion as well, infantry battalion. And I'd watch what my artillery battery was doing, and my LNO was doing with that battalion. One of the first things I did when I got there is move the artillery liaison officers down to the infantry brigades and down the infantry battalions, because we wanted ownership. What my rule was, anything the infantry battalion commander or brigade commander wants, they get it unless it's disapproved by me personally. So you had to, because that's the way we were going to support people if we went to war. So we had very good relationships with them, and that's the way I got a chance to know my battery commanders, my first sergeants, my chiefs of smoke, and my liaison officers and the like. So we had some terrific officers, and but you went out to observe them is how they worked with the infantry, because that's who they're going to have to work with. These same guys would then provide shooting fire for these guys when we did all these live fires. So we were in the field all the time. But the ADCs were out there all the time, because not only were they there when I was there, they were there when all the infantry were doing their thing. So it was quite a field-oriented division. So you had fun doing what you're doing because it was busy. Still is busy. It's part of the business division in the Army.
Amazing level of competence among privates and sergeants. Struck by how.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example. I went out there one day on a parachute jump on the western edge of Fort Bragg with a battalion combat team with one of my artillery batteries, and neither the battery commander, nor the first sergeant, nor the chief of smoke, nor the executive officer landed in the drop zone, because the battery commander didn't know his business and had not properly cross-loaded, and his airplane had aborted, and all these principals in the battery didn't get there. The battery was set up and ready to go. Some sergeant moved up to be the chief of smoke and got the battery laid. Liaison officer came down, got the fire direction going and all that kind of stuff. So the competence was truly good. And it's not that we didn't work at competencies, we did. We had all sorts of competitions that we ran in the diverty in order to make sure that the section chiefs felt good about what they were doing, as well as the batteries felt good about what they were doing. Shot a lot of bullets, shot about 27,000 rounds a year. Used to beg, borrow, and steal ammunition from other 105 battery or battalions and brigades that didn't shoot. So the allowance was about 20,000, and we were able to shoot about 27,000 a year. A lot of artillery rounds.
What did the junior people, were they not spooked by the presence of you and one of the ADCs?
No, it was commonplace. I mean, everybody knew that's what's going to happen. We didn't get in there and you didn't get in there from the point of view of trying to run the RSOC for the unit while it was doing its work. What you did was you observed people. And if you didn't like what you saw, you told the battery commander to shape it up. But you can't observe that if you're not out there in the field with them. So, I mean, the principle of an artillery outfit coming in by parachute is how fast can you de-rig? Did the people get there to do it? Are you in a position ready to fire? Well, I mean, you can't observe that from afar. You got to be on the scene to figure that out. So, the thing to do is jump with the troops, observe all that. When you got a healthy dose of things are going right, watch them move with an air mobile, see how well they were able to rig. So it was a matter of assessment of how is the training state here, as opposed to having somebody tell you about it.
Right. Well, yes, I can see that. I was just wondering if there was The relationship between you and General Croson was one that he had great trust and confidence in you and let you do your job. And I could see that if that atmosphere went from you to your battalion commanders, from your battalion commanders to your battery commanders, they could feel comfortable with you being there and with the ADC.
You'd have to ask them about that.
Yeah.
I can't report to you.
You could tell if people were stuttering and stammering or whether they
Yeah, my view generally is that didn't happen. I mean, maybe it did, but, and I didn't get the feedback about it, but, you know, the notion of jumping with the troops, the notion of, when he told me I was the safety officer for an infantry battalion with live fire, mortars, machine guns, Cobras, 105 howitzers, 155 howitzers, all the infantry weapons and all that. You can bet your ass I was out there making sure nobody got killed. In fact, I was the point man.
Yeah,
So if anybody got killed, I'd get killed. Had a radio on my back. Operated with a forward observer and the lead element of the infantry battalion doing his thing. You know, it wasn't personal bravado, it had to do with responsibility. And we didn't kill anybody. We killed some troops in a preparatory exercise when I wasn't out there. So I had to relieve a battalion commander as a result. At a border accident.
Was that an infantry?